So we're going to begin with Richard, the Tisch Professor of Law at NYU.
I think.
Oh, excuse me, Brian first, and then we will move to Richard. The format will be that they will each address the issues for 5 minutes, and then they will have the opportunity to each rebut what the other person, some of the elements of the other person's comments, again for 5 minutes. And we do have a timekeeper, so I don't have a hook, but I can grab you if you go on too long. So with that, Brian.
You better give me the mic.
I need to give you
Well, if I've got 5 minutes, I better get started and speak quickly. So the central problem with off-label drug use is that we have an information deficit. When the FDA approves a drug for on-label use, that approval is based on scientifically valid and statistically significant evidence that says, we're going to give you a drug which is potentially dangerous, but it's likely that the benefits outweigh the risks. And we know that because we've studied the drug in a controlled environment. But that information simply isn't available with off-label use. Over 70% of off-label prescriptions aren't based on scientific evidence or significant scientific evidence. And that's a real problem because all drugs have a risk of serious side effects, and patients shouldn't be exposing themselves to risk without evidence that a drug will be effective. And when evidence is available, it isn't at the level of what the FDA requires for a new approval, and generally it's a very low quality. Frequently you have physicians just prescribing a drug because they think it'll work, or they've heard from another doctor it might work, and they're informing their practice based on what they hear from select patients. And that's how medicine was practiced 100 years ago, and that's the worst kind of medical practice. Also, no one is systematically collecting information on off-label uses and patient outcomes. When drugs are used off-label, physicians are just independently getting anecdotal reports from patients, from select patients, and they often don't share that. So not only are patients using drugs we don't know are safe and effective, but we're not getting good feedback to inform future practice. On the other hand, we don't want to prohibit off-label uses because it's never going to be possible to study every drug for every possible use. And some off-label uses do have reasonable scientific evidence, and others have been around for a long time with reported benefit and little adverse effects. So that's the off-label problem. How do we balance patient access with preventing harm, and what role should the FDA play? And right now the FDA plays a very minimal role, and there is very little government regulation in this area. Once a drug is approved, with a few exceptions, the FDA lets physicians use it however they want. In fact, we don't have enough regulation, and we need to be thinking about new ways to get third parties involved in the process. But if you think we have too much regulation, it's helpful to look back at history and see how we got here. Because 100 years ago, we had a system where the FDA didn't do any regulation, and companies could market however we wanted. And we got a series of tragedies, from sulfanilamide, which led to the FDA evaluating for safety, to thalidomide, which involved the FDA evaluating for efficacy, to drugs like Vioxx, which are behind the 2007 FDA amendments. And all of these cases have convinced the public we need a centralized system and some public oversight. So this march towards greater oversight hasn't been accidental, and the idea that we should return to an earlier period ignores history or misinterprets it. And history, as well as common sense, tells you that we can't just leave this for the market and after-the-fact tort liability to handle. We can't regulate by having consumers reward or punish firms or suing them after the fact because of the human cost. If someone's hurt by a drug, even if they were able to get compensation, and even if we could punish a company for doing something bad, that's not the kind of system we want to have. We want a system that prevents someone from being injured rather than compensates them for it. Second, we don't have a market in which value-based competition occurs. So consumers are insulated from the price of drugs because of insurance, and they don't have good information on which drugs are more helpful, not at least for most off-label uses, and certainly not for comparative effectiveness research between different types of drugs. So without good information on quality and cost, you can't have meaningful competition. So the FDA now restricts what pharmaceutical companies can say, and that's a very wise policy, because even a cursory examination of the pharmaceutical industry shows it's not an industry that will regulate itself. Pharmaceutical companies are in business to make money for their shareholders, which is fine, but they have tremendous incentives to oversell off-label uses that outweigh their potential liability. It could become a cost of doing business. So in 2009, Pfizer was fined $2.3 billion for off-label promotion of Bextra and 3 other drugs, but that was only 14% of the $17 billion it earned from selling those drugs. Also in 2009, Eli Lilly paid $1.4 billion for illegally promoting Zyprexa off-label, but it had made, at that point, $36 billion from the drug over that period. And those are a couple of examples, but every major pharmaceutical firm has been prosecuted for illegal promotion. Firms have promoted based on selective publication and poorly designed trials, funding consumer organizations to promote off-label use, and paying physicians to recommend off-label uses. And pharmaceutical company promotion is a very effective practice that has been shown to influence prescribing practices. It's not for nothing the industry spent $27 billion on drug promotion in 2012, $24 billion of which went to marketing to physicians. And these sorts of behavior should be very concerning to regulators and to you, because promoting off-label uses without evidence of safety and efficacy is more likely to result in significant harm and it wastes resources. And one of the tenets of medicine is that doctors should first do no harm, which is why as a faculty member in the School of Medicine, I can no longer get free pens or free lunches or free trips to Hawaii from drug reps. And while that's very unfortunate for me, life is full of disappointment. Am I getting a 5-minute cue or do I have more time?
30 seconds. I'll give you 30 seconds.
All right, I get 30 seconds. Awesome. So what should we do instead? A number of people have proposed that we basically strengthen this system by stricter criminal and civil penalties, by enhanced enforcement, by stronger firewalls between drug funding and academics and publishing research, publishing full clinical trial results rather than selective publications, which is what they go off to journals. In an article I have forthcoming with Ian Ayres at Yale Law School, we're talking about a new framework for this sort of thing. First, in getting more data by requiring pharmaceutical companies to submit to the...
Just finish the sentence.
By requiring the drug companies to report the detailing information they have on off-label uses to the FDA, and a bunch of other things, which, if you're interested, you can read the paper.
Good job.
Thank you. I think I have a somewhat different view of this particular issue. Is this on? Can you hear me?
No, where's the go?
So we'll move it...
Well, I think
it should be on.
It should be on now?
But you don't have the mic on.
Oh, I don't have the mic on me. Okay, don't count this against my time, please. A somewhat different view, and let me start back at the beginning. There are two ways in which you can start to deal with drugs. One of them is to try to regulate them before they hit the market, and the other is to try to regulate them afterwards. The way in which Ryan put the thing, it sort of makes it appear as though there are relatively few errors that exist in the pre-clearance mechanism associated with the FDA, and most of those errors would be from letting drugs on the market too rapidly. Now, those of us who work in the area sometimes take a different view that the great problem that you have with respect to the FDA is that it keeps drugs off the market too long. And so if you just simply concentrate your attention on those particular drugs, which are in fact in the marketplace after FDA approval, and ask how many years they were kept off the marketplace by virtue of the period of inspection, review, and so forth that they had, you now realize that there's another kind of error cost which is every bit as important, namely the error cost associated with keeping these drugs off the market for too long a period. It turns out that the very costly and cumbrous situation I'm talking about has only gotten worse in recent years. It takes well over $1 billion today and probably 7 or 8 years of clinical trials before you could get something onto the marketplace, which means that the level of introduction in this country is very, very slow. And many of the drugs which are not available at a given time in this country are in fact available elsewhere throughout the world, where the clinical barriers to entry are much smaller and much less effective. Now, once it turns out that you have this very difficult situation whereby the faucet is kept too tight at the beginning, people are going to try to adopt to see what they can do to get better medical treatment. And on this particular point, you have to understand something about the scope of off-label uses with many particular areas. So if you're starting to talk about cancer drugs, for example, nobody knows the precise numbers, but it's probably somewhere between 75 and 90% of the uses with respect to the drugs in question are in fact off-label uses. These are, of course, obviously very, very intense numbers. Most of it takes place without illegal promotion by the drug companies, because what happens is the physicians decide, for one reason or another, that they're better off using an off-label use than having a patient die when the existing treatments are known to be ineffective. The question then is, how do you make a decision on which of these drugs you want to use and why you make it? And what Ryan said is not accurate about the way the mechanism works. Of course, there is a little bit of hearsay and hands and saying, hey, I tried this on patient X and it seemed to work. Why don't you try it on patient Y? But the need for good information on this stuff is so valuable and so impressing that informal organizations and formal organizations have developed to serve as intermediaries between individual physicians on the one hand and the individual and the drug companies on the other. So there is an organization, for example, known as the NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, and this is a voluntary organization, and what it does in effect is it collects information about the various uses of the various drugs that are put on the market, including their off-label uses. The organization is much more efficient and much more rational than the FDA, which is terrible on approval, because the only thing that the FDA can tell you when it gives approval is can you sell it or can you not sell it. And then what they typically do is they give you a set of warnings which are so heavily weighted towards the risks associated with the drugs that oftentimes it discourages drugs from use, which in fact have positive expected value for the patient. So there's a widespread practice of individual physicians to tend to disregard the FDA warnings and to look at those which are generated by independent physicians working collaboratively. Well, what do these physicians do? Well, they operate a fairly comprehensive network. They get real-time data not only from the use of drugs in the United States, but from the use of these drugs overseas. When they start to make their recommendations, they don't simply say this is or is not approved. They tend to do two other things of vital importance with respect to drug use. Well, one of them is they rank the drugs in order of use. So if you're dealing with the cancer patients, for example, there are first-line treatments, second-line treatments, and so forth down the line. It's extremely important that you know the sequence in which these drugs are to be used. The FDA provides you no information of value on this particular point, but the NCCN and the 4 or 5 other organizations that work in this same space actually give you extremely useful information on the way in which these things start to work. The second point to note about FDA approval processes is that they simply look at drugs in isolation, and they don't talk about the very important question of what combination of two drugs may be more efficient than the single use of either of these drugs. Am I done? Let me finish the sentence. That the drugs in isolation, and that information is so valuable that in effect the reason the off-label uses are so important is that if you try to get rid of them, the entire system of American practice would collapse. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me start with Richard's comments on the informal or formal organizations versus the FDA. So first of all, I am certainly not against voluntary organizations like NCCM compiling and disseminating information. I think it's very helpful, although I think there is a very real concern that has been shown that a number of these organizations, and I'm not specifically referring to NCCN, have industry funding, and that one should be very suspect of that. And when you're comparing it to the FDA, one of the great benefits of the FDA is transparency. So the FDA has now very stringent conflict of interest rules and disclosure requirements, and private organizations are not upfront about that sort of thing. The idea that they are better suited than the FDA, I would highly disagree with for several reasons. First of all, these private organizations generally have ad hoc funding. The FDA's budget this year is $5 billion. So it is an institution, and a very large institution, and one that has significant technical expertise that is often lacking in private organizations. Those private organizations' compendia have been criticized by a number of academics. They aren't nearly as comprehensive. Also, the FDA has better access to data. It is the organization that requires pharmaceutical companies to report adverse events to them. It can demand from pharmaceutical companies patient source level data, so the actual data in clinical trials rather than what they choose to report. They have agreements where they share data with foreign regulatory agencies. They can tap into the Center for Medicare and Medicaid data sets, private insurer data sets. They have an adverse event reporting system physicians and patients can report to. So they have vastly superior data, they have superior resources, and they are the only organization that can require pharmaceutical companies to conduct post-market studies if they detect a unexpected serious risk of that. So while I think it's important we have voluntary organizations, and I think there is a greater role for private organizations, I don't think it's possible that they could replace the FDA and what they're doing. Richard mentioned the oncology sphere, so that is one of the areas of medicine where there is a very high level of off-label use. Statistics are generally that about 20% of prescribing is off-label use, but in cancer it can be 50 or even as high as 90 in certain areas where people have rare types of cancer and there is really weak research. But that argument cuts against his own argument that pharmaceutical companies should be disseminating this information. That is a very sophisticated group of oncologists who are often in academic settings, and those doctors are very savvy about seeking out information on off-label uses, and frankly, they don't need pharmaceutical reps in there telling them about this research. They will get it themselves, and they can get it from private organizations and compendia. That was most, I think, of what it was. The other things that he said. So the $1.3 billion to bring a drug to market is a very controversial number that comes out of an industry-funded study. And the pharmaceutical industry is not transparent about where that number comes from. Other academics have placed it far less, but it's very dependent on what the drug is. If it's a Me Too drug, which is very similar to a drug that's already been marketed, what subpopulations it needs to be studied in, what phase 1 and 2 trials show in terms of its likely safety and efficacy, and every drug has its own FDA approval process. Just this month in JAMA Internal Medicine, there was a new article that looked at all the drugs approved in 2008. It was 6.5 years till approval from when the FDA said start clinical trials, and the FDA spent 10 months reviewing it. And they do have a number of accelerated approval programs that significantly shorten that time, but that's that. Also, pre-clearance errors. So most of these drugs, very briefly, the FDA requires 3 sets of trials: phase 1 trials, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. Phase 1 trials are very small groups of patients, 20 to 80, often healthy volunteers. Phase 2 and 3 are in much larger patient groups. The FDA requires all of those. Most of the drugs that are in phase 1 trials don't ever make it out, and that's because these clinical trials show that they are not safe and they are not infected for their intended use, and all of these drugs are very dangerous. And you should only be using them if you have good evidence that it is likely it's going to produce more benefit than harm. And the idea that we should just sort of let all these drugs out and let people experiment on them turns the population into a bunch of guinea pigs. And perhaps there is a certain amount of that, but at the least pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be promoting their own drugs for that purpose and shouldn't be overselling the benefits of them and downselling the risk, or at risk significant patient injury. And again, there's an endless number of cases in which that's occurred where patients have been seriously injured by it. I'll talk briefly about the case of thalidomide because I have 30 seconds left, but that was a drug in Germany and particularly Europe that was approved as a sedative hypnotic, and the manufacturer said, let's start marketing this for morning sickness, and no one stopped them from doing that, and everyone in the world was taking it. And the FDA said, you've never studied this in pregnant women or even pregnant animals, we're not going to permit it here. Sure enough, what happened was 2,000 dead babies and 10,000 severe birth injuries, and that was a manufacturer promoting their drug for an off-label use where it just wasn't safe and it just hadn't been studied.
Time.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. The thalidomide case, of course, thalidomide is now on the market. It is a drug called Thalmid, and it is used to treat leprosy and various kinds of... the microphone. It is used to treat a whole variety of conditions. Is it better now? So that the dangers of letting them on are there. But one of the things you have to understand is that there are many different propositions here. One is, I'm not saying in effect here, although I could argue it elsewhere, that you want to let drugs that go through no clinical trials to be used. Remember, an off-label drug has gone through a phase 1 trial already, which indicates very clearly that the drug in question does not have the highly toxic effects, and so that when you decide to use it for an off-label use, you have a much larger information set available to it than you do when you try to use it under circumstances when it's not been tested at all. So one cannot sort of infer that there is no information based upon it. Secondly, there have been huge amounts of these uses, and if in fact they were as deleterious as you would expect to see some serious reconsideration of these uses, and some studies which show that they had high levels of toxicity and dangers. But as best I can tell, there's been no definitive study of that sort which has indicated that the uses in question, given that they are already of drugs approved, has had the kinds of consequences that we're talking about here. The second point is I did not talk about drug company promotion with respect to these things. I talked about it with respect to these other independent agencies. Now, when you talk about the FDA, I mean, the level of incompetence in the FDA in many of these cases is quite legendary. I can give you chapter and verse of people who go there, and what typically happens is the FDA has 1 or 2 people who are expert, for example, in cancers, and all the doctors and the companies who come before them have much narrower and much deeper levels of expertise, and the delay feature is an extremely important course. For example, there are organizations out there which have advocated these drugs for many, many years. Virtually every one of them turns out to make it on the market 5 or 6 years later, and that's critically important. When you deal with the term of drugs, the reason why the cost is $1.2 billion or so forth is that you have to invest your money in trials very early on before you go to the sale, and a lot of it is the time value of money. One of the studies, a terrible study by Bud Relman, who essentially knows nothing about finance, decides that interest carrying costs should not be treated as a cost of producing drugs because it's borne by a corporation and not by an industry or by an individual. So a man who knows absolutely nothing about finance simply docks out 80% of the cost because he doesn't understand all of the dynamics associated with the industry. The conflict of interest point is exactly backwards. One of the problems that you have with the FDA is, if you look at it, it refuses to allow anybody with industry connections on any panel to deal with any drug. So what it does is it gets a very small subset of people. Most of the competent ones do some degree of consulting. Their committees have very high vacancy rates and very low average quality. So all these sort of bureaucratic expertise that are put forward are in fact serious disadvantages in the way in which that organization runs. It is morbidly inefficient, it is rigid, it is outdated, it simply is, for example, utterly unable to deal with problems of personal medicine. It doesn't know how to take into account evidence that you get from use inside the field in a coherent fashion, and as I mentioned before, it doesn't take into account drug interactions and so forth. Its warnings are almost always too severe with respect to the problems at hand. The organization is not a model of what it is that you want. It is essentially a model which might have worked for 1950, 1960 medicine. It certainly does not work today. And in fact, the 1962 Kefauver-Harris bill, which was done in response to thalidomide, addressed an issue of effectiveness which was not at stake. It was a safety issue that could have been gotten at on other situations. And the effect of that legislation, by the time it went through, was to take hundreds of drugs with long satisfactory histories of consumer use and force them off the market because nobody could afford to send them through major clinical trials. You're looking here at an industry which is seriously broken. Off-label uses is an essential correction for the very bad type of situations that has in the early approval process. Do not assume that these characters who are sitting there because they announce that they're in favor of the public actually know what they are talking about. In many cases, it turns out that they are wrong, and they become insecure. When they do is they ask for more and more clinical trials. It slows things up. The interaction between the shortened patent life on the one hand and the FDA approval has created a real sort of dulling effect on innovation. The number of new drugs that gets through has fallen consistently over the last several years. The United States is not itself a model of good sense and good judgment on any of these particular kinds of issues. We ought not to think of the FDA as though it is somehow or other an exemplar. What we should remember is that all administrative agencies have their own bureaucratic incentives. They are not faithful agents for the public interest. They have their whole bureaucratic dominance. The FDA gets slaughtered if it lets a drug on the market, which turns out to have adverse side effects. It suffers no rebuke if it keeps something off which is very, very safe. And so its incentives for caution tend to lead to its distortions. Thank you.
Let me ask the two of you to speak to the issue that one of you mentioned, the fact that drugs are available in other parts of the world, and in this increasingly global society, what are the implications for the topic that you're addressing? Ryan, do you want to go first? Or?
I'll go second.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, look, one of the things you have to understand is an inherent series of biases associated with clinical trials. One of them, by definition, they have to be relatively short, and oftentimes what you're worried about are long-term adverse effects, which you can't pick up by simply increasing the dosage over a short period of time. And if you have foreign uses that are available out there which have the long time horizon, it's going to give you a kind of information that is, in fact, very important. The second point is what the FDA has done over the years is it demands that the clinical trials be done on ever smaller groups of the population. So you have racial differences, pregnant women are separate, people by way of ages, and you run out of the number of suitable subjects that you could have in order to run a clinical trial which will have sufficient numbers so as to give you any kind of significance. They also only start at particular points in time, and so it's not a question of just getting people with type 2 lymphoma. You got to get them with that kind of condition on September 1st, 2013 in order for this particular study to work. So the whole system is broken down, and let me just make it very clear. The drug companies are completely complacent when it comes to attacking the FDA because they have divided motives. On the one hand, they make drugs that are incumbent in the market, and they're quite happy to see a new drug stay off the market because what it does is it increases the effective life of the ones. The people who are absolutely apoplectic about the way in which the FDA works are the patient groups, because they understand exactly what the cost is with respect to these delays. The most famous of them is the case of Abigail's Alliance and Abigail Burroughs, and she tried to get the use of Erbitux now on the market, and they delayed and they hemmed and they hawed, giving her a special permission to use it, and it arrived the day she died at age 21. Not a nice situation. Erbitux is now on the market. And so what you do is these error costs are very, very high. The clinical trials are not nearly as, quote, scientific as one would want to think they are, and the raw data from the field properly interpreted is an enormous benefit, and the FDA just doesn't look at it, and the NCCN does. So you talk about all these expertise that it has. If it's going to turn a blind eye to anything that it doesn't generate, it's worse than worthless. It's dangerous.
Well, I wouldn't agree with most of that. So the FDA has announced very sensibly that to let a drug on a market, we need double-blinded, randomized controlled trials because that is the best type of scientific framework to evaluate whether or not a drug is safe and effective. That being said, we do have a rich resource of observational data once a drug goes on the market, both in other countries and in these countries. And the FDA needs to be doing a much better job of policing post-market use, which it really doesn't do, in large part because it isn't well funded to do that. And as part of the 2007 amendments, pharmaceutical companies demanded that the user fees they were paying to speed the approval process just go to the pre-approval part, but the FDA isn't doing enough in policing drugs that are on the market by looking at what's actually happening with patients, what kind of outcomes are coming out, and how much are these being used. The FDA is requiring that these studies be done in smaller groups of patients, but that is for a very good reason. Thalidomide is an example. If you don't test a drug in a pregnant population, you really don't know how it works for pregnant patients. And children and elderly people have different metabolic reactions to drugs, and so you can't take a drug that's approved for an adult and give it to a child and expect it to have the same sort of outcome. And so if we are going to use these drugs in different populations, as we should, you need to do better studies with them. Where there are drugs that treat orphan diseases, rare diseases where you don't have a lot of people, the FDA is very flexible about allowing patient numbers in as long as you can show it's safe and effective. And there are a number of mechanisms in place to speed the approval process for that. And you don't all need them there at the same day. You can do a longitudinal study where you look at patients over the course of a year or even 2 years and they get enrolled as they come in when you don't have a lot of patients like that. And also that these foreign agencies, every country has its own regulatory framework, and that's valuable for us for looking at best practices. Some are stricter than the FDA, like the European Medicines Agencies. Some are less strict, and we have a valuable set of data from these other countries and clinical trials there that we should use in our own post-market surveillance.
But don't. Look, the whole system with respect to this stuff, you have to ask the following question. There are two stages of judgment. The first one is do you let it on the market. The second one is whether you use it. And one of the things to remember is that many drugs have received FDA approval and they just bomb when they actually hit the marketplace. Why is it? Because there still is clinical judgment and sort of collective wisdom on that, which says, yes, this thing is now legal, but it's not suitable for my patient. The amount of physician judgment after a drug is approved downstream is enormous. And there's nothing about the kind of information that Ryan talked about which is exclusive to the FDA. Even I know that children have different metabolic reactions than adults. So does every practicing physician, so does every expertise group. And so it's quite clear that you have to be cautious about the inferences that are going to be made, but it doesn't follow that the FDA is the organization to make them. You put yourself out there in a position where you have somebody who's taken 3 recognized drugs for treatment, all of which have been non-responsive. The question is, do you try an off-label drug or just let somebody try? And one of the things that the FDA does is it always uses the wrong measure of decisions. It says, is this thing safe and effective? That's not the correct test. The correct test is always, is the expected value of this particular use for this particular patient positive or negative? And it turns out there are many cases where that equation is clearly, manifestly, overwhelmingly positive, and yet you flunk the FDA test. The FDA has nobody there.
Let me intervene for just a moment and pursue this point you've just made.
Okay.
You're suggesting that we change the framework under which the FDA would operate, change the standard that they're applying. Ryan, what would be wrong with that?
Well, thank you, and I would like to respond to that. The idea that physicians can just sort of decide on their professional judgment whether or not a patient should be getting a drug isn't a very good argument. The reason the FDA requires these pediatric studies is so that a physician can look at the pediatric study and say, should I be giving this to a kid? Well, here's some scientific evidence that shows how children respond to it, instead of, well, I think I'll give them half a pill and we'll see what happens. That is not a good way to practice medicine. And so while it is expensive and burdensome to do these studies, they are needed for physicians to practice medicine scientifically, and critical for that. What isn't right about this? It is always a safe benefit determination. It is never just a question of safety, because all drugs are dangerous. And they only become safe if there is evidence that it is more likely to be helpful than it is to be harmful. If it was just a question of whether or not a drug was safe, everyone could go out and take a drug, and you wouldn't have to have a physician acting as a gatekeeper, right? And part of the libertarian argument would say, well, patients should just be able to get whatever they want, but they shouldn't. They need physician gatekeepers and FDA gatekeepers. And he mentioned Abigail's Alliance, which was a very sad case of a young girl who died and wasn't able to get a treatment that was eventually approved, but that is one example out of millions of patients, and it is far more likely that these drugs would not have survived clinical trials and that it would not have been helpful, although in this case it was. And it's not a question of her taking a drug because she's got nothing else to do. It's a question of her taking a drug that is potentially very toxic and could shorten her life, and in her remaining time she would have very poor quality of life. And that information just does not exist for patients to make an evaluation on their own, and that is why we have to do clinical studies before we open it up.
The problem with that is you're sitting there, and it would take you another 5 years to run this clinical trial, and you have to make the decision tomorrow because your patient's not going to live more than 90 days unless you do something. The idea that you have to put everything on hold when you have some information that's better than random is a terrible mistake. And under these circumstances, the question that a physician faces is, I know that this is very bad, but I know what the alternatives are. And remember, every approved drug has to have a downstream judgment by a physician as to whether or not it is applicable. There is nobody, even in a libertarian world, who thinks that patients are going to self-medicate with respect to advanced cancer treatments. Abigail was in the care of the best physicians at Johns Hopkins Hospital, all of whom said she should be able to receive this drug. And they knew what they were talking about. Abigail Alliance as an organization has recommended a number of drugs for approval. They have a 100% hit rate. Every one that they recommend has always eventually been approved. You're not talking about one case, you're just talking about one case that got publicity and got somebody so mad that he formed an organization. If you just simply take the number of people who die of given conditions and figure out what the delays are, you're going to come up with hundreds of lost years of lives in this situation. And remember, these clinical studies, after you do them, they may be quote-unquote authoritative, but they may be no good for a whole variety of reasons, including the fact that they're uncareful. And what you have to understand is when you say a drug cost benefit, there is a high variance in the user population. And it may well be that a drug will flunk a clinical trial. But if you could figure out the subpopulation for which it works, the upper tail, those are the guys who benefit. And letting it on the market then allows you to figure out whether or not somebody is a person who is resistant to this drug, don't use it, or susceptible to the drug, do use it, and you can't take into account the variance under a clinical trial. They only do on-off judgments, and physicians are always doing incremental judgment. The FDA is essentially methodologically so primitive in terms of the way in which it thinks about medicine that it ought not to be allowed to operate under its current frame.
Well, I mean, as a result of the Abigail's Alliance, in part, the FDA does allow a compassionate use program that allows patients to get these drugs in certain circumstances for life-threatening illnesses. But we should be very careful about giving these drugs to patients because they are more likely to be harmful than not until proven otherwise. And you have to be very careful about looking at this in hindsight bias, right? It's easy to look at a patient who died and a drug that was eventually approved and say, oh, well, we should have just approved that drug right off the bat. What did we even do a clinical trial for? Everyone knew it was okay. Well, no, they really didn't. They didn't know until the clinical trial data came out. And it ignores the value of clinical trials and also the fact that, unfortunately, we need to do these clinical trials to know they're safe and effective. And this is a reason to get patients engaged in the clinical trials, to do that sort of research which benefits everyone. Clinical trials are not perfect, but they are the best possible way physicians have come up with to evaluate evidence for using a drug. And the issue of variance sort of ignores, well, first it's an argument for testing more subpopulations of patients to see if maybe this is good somewhere. And second, that gets back to the thalidomide argument. So if you give thalidomide to everyone, you might find it helps with Hansen's disease, which is leprosy, in a few patients. And you might find that you've now got 10,000 severe birth defects because everyone's just out trying the drug and we're seeing what happens. And that's, again, why that is not a good system to do.
Nobody advocates that you take a drug and apply it to pregnant women without some kind of subtest. This is basically saying that nobody learned from that when everybody has learned from that. So when you start to figure out what's going on today, everybody understands that. And in fact, there are many drugs that are licensed and they're not licensed for pregnant women. And then what happens is many physicians do the following thing. I know there's a serious risk here, but the alternative is worse. So I'm going to make the off-label decision to use this on a pregnant woman given the knowledge that you have. The FDA can only work with aggregates. Physicians can work with people. And it turns out the downstream data is almost always better than the clinical trials, most of which have very serious methodological limitations associated with their operation. You want to say, oh, we'll just test it on another subpopulation. It may take you 4 years to accumulate enough data to see whether it works on that particular population. Why on earth do you want to wait? I'm not trying to ban clinical trials, and in fact, one of the things that you say in favor of markets is that companies who try these things, oftentimes the drugs like dealing with cholesterol and so forth, you can get very large populations and you get very good data from clinical trials that they don't work and you take them off. But they would be off the market even if you didn't have an FDA. Nobody wants to go forward to a group of users, for example, like the HMOs and say, well, we have this drug, we're going to conceal from you all the adverse data, and oh, by the way, it isn't effective, but pay us $3 billion for it anyhow. Every single major buyer of drugs runs its own independent efficacy studies with respect to the subject population that it has and does not rely on the FDA data, which is too gross and too unrefined for the purposes they have. You have another question, Susan?
Let me ask you both to talk about how this downstream data can be marshaled in a world now where communication is so easy. Assembling of databases is so much easier than it would have been in a different era.
Well, it's not through the FDA, because when you report to the FDA, they send you a huge investigative form, which could take hours to fill out and could subject you to potential liabilities. So you go through the NCCN, they get it no circumstances. And you have to understand, by the way, just to make this very clear, NCN standards are in fact used for insurance purposes for coverage, so off-label uses are covered, and it's used as the standard of care in medical malpractice cases. So you're not talking about something which everybody simply does as catch can. They can get it. The FDA just cannot collect this data because physicians will not report to it. Nobody trusts them because you know that you report it, they're going to spend 10 of your hours cross-examining you as to why you used it in the first place. It's a terribly counterproductive system.
Well, I definitely disagree with that, and I think that the FDA is the most appropriate party to do this. First of all, because when a drug manufacturer becomes aware of side effects, and doctors and patients do let drug manufacturers know about side effects, they by statute have to report it to the FDA. The FDA has a very doctor-friendly website that I've used, the adverse event reporting system that is online that you can go on and fill out a patient adverse event. And yes, it takes a little bit of time, but we're doctors to help people, and they have access to things that NCCN doesn't. They have access to clinical trial data. They have access to overseas databases from foreign regulatory agencies. They have access to data from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They have access to private insurer databases. Part of the problem is that this data is fragmented, and I would totally disagree with the argument that every private payer is running its own efficacy studies, but a number of private payers do have their own data sets and data mining. In the case of Vioxx, for example, long before it was pulled, the VA and Kaiser and other insurers pulled the drug from their formularies or restricted access to it. And part of the problem right now is everyone's doing that in isolation, and really we should be looking collectively at all of this information. And we need a way to get all of the information assembled, to have the FDA evaluating it, and also to incentivize third parties to evaluate it. And actually, my last paper was on saying that first, the FDA ought to be collecting and disseminating this information in a de-identified way, and that we ought to create a bounty system for third parties to evaluate this data, and when they produce evidence that a drug is not safe and effective, that there should be a payment from the government or from another party to incentivize the private industry to get involved in this whole process. And really, it doesn't need to be one or the other. We can have great private voluntary organizations doing this sort of research and the FDA.
But all you need to do in this case is have the FDA turn its data over to the private organization. There are trade secret issues, but they will do a better job in evaluation of it than the guys. I remember at least one case I worked on involving a drug called Exelsen, where the biostatisticians on the private side were so much more sophisticated than the guys working on the governance side that it was an embarrassment to see what happened when the government decided that a clinical trial that had one bad arm was to be killed off after you spend $320 million when there in fact were techniques available in order to save it. I think if people actually work with the FDA, the staggering incompetence of most of its sort of high-bound bureaucratic type figures is something which is very large. I agree with you. You'd love to assemble databases. There are trade secret issues and all the rest of that stuff. But I would much rather than be evaluated by a private organizations of professional physicians working on a voluntary basis than by the FDA, which simply is so worried about letting stuff with adverse events. Let me just mention Vioxx for a second. You know, this is a drug which was over-promoted by Merck. I think it's fairly clear. I've seen the ads. I was frankly horrified at it because Merck is generally regarded as one of the best companies out there. But when you actually saw the case data on this stuff and the litigation stuff, two things happened. One is a lot of the claims for damages were completely fraudulent. People had not even taken tablets but claimed side effects. The famous case in Angleton was a case of perjured testimony in these things. But the most important feature is, remember this about Vioxx, for treating bleeding in operational settings, that is in operating rooms, post-surgery, it is still the best drug available. And when you take it off the market, it's one thing to say, okay, you can't sell it to consumers. It's another thing to say that you can't use it in hospital. And the FDA essentially did an unnecessarily broad kind of prohibition because it was afraid that some of this stuff might leak out into the general market. They did not handle the Vioxx situation at all well. The truth about the matter is, as I recall one person saying to me, is he said, when the issue is whether or not you could return your Vioxx in order to get your money back, what you did is you found patients for whom it was successful hoarding the drug and trying to get other supplies, even though it was off market. There's a lot of downstream information. These patients become, with chronic diseases, tremendously knowledgeable, and that information is completely shut out of the FDA process.
Well, I'd like to...
So let me suggest, with about 20 minutes remaining, that we begin to take questions from the audience. And I think we have one minute.
My recollection of the thalidomide problem was that you had a drug that had been approved by the FDA, and that it was only when the use of that drug began to appear, or the effects of it began to appear in a lot of babies that have been delivered out in the real world, so to speak, by doctors, that the doctors made the discovery of the harmful effects, notified the FDA on it, and rather than being something that was a result of some predetermined scientific study. And I wonder if this doesn't result in a problem of costs that we often ignore with regard to the whole regulatory process. And that's something that came out of a study done by Sam Peltzman many years ago on insurance, that once we get insured, and maybe get overly insured, we become a little less careful about how we behave. We get a false sense of security in our actions, and thus increase injuries. And I wonder if this isn't one of the problems we have with the government regulation, that when any product, it doesn't have to just be a drug, it could be food or the Food and Drug Administration, you come back to the origins of that, and you find that this is part of the reason that the food industry was the one that promoted the Food and Drug Act. They wanted the government imprimatur on their products so that people out there in the society would have a sense of security that this is really good, healthful food. Don't we run into that problem here?
Yes. By the way, the FDA in 1906 did not have any power to review new drugs for safety or for efficacy. It was only an agency that could prevent the shipment in interstate commerce of those drugs which were made that were not pure. So it was the Pure Food and Drug Act. The only control that it had over manufacture before the 1937 constitutional revolution was with respect to drugs that were made in the territory. And the 38 regime was a regime which allowed oversight. But the oversight that it allowed did not require you to go through the FDA. It said if the FDA wanted to review the drug, it could call it in for some kinds of trials. And the level of new drugs coming into the market at that period was vastly greater than it's been in the post stuff. Yes, there is that problem. If the FDA approves it, do we not worry about it? I don't think it's that serious today, because I think everybody who's in this business understands that given variations in patient behavior, given the difference in combinations of drugs, that you have to be very careful and watch patients individually. So I don't think that that's the major problem. I think the delay and the heterogeneity problems are much more important.
My response would be, well, it's been a little while since I've really reviewed thalidomide, but no, my recollection was that the FDA kept it from coming on the market, and that has been one of their great successes. And in fact, the person who kept it from coming on the market got some sort of special award that made him feel very warm and fuzzy. As to whether are we complacent because the FDA has reviewed a medicine, I don't know if the answer is to pull FDA regulation so that we're suddenly not so confident our drugs are safe and effective. I mean, I think it's better that we at least have some standard for evaluating whether they are safe than none, and that withdrawing that for that purpose wouldn't be a good public health move.
I'm looking for more questions now. Yes.
This was amazing. Thank you both. I want to just make a comment and a question. As a practicing physician, that I have a master in clinical research and significant experience in that, I yet have to come across to a physician who has not been funded by a pharmaceutical company who disagrees with Professor Abbott. So every one of us within the medical community have a consensus that FDA is doing a good job in terms of preventing some of these things from happening. In terms of Abigail's situation, I don't think she had end-stage cancer. I don't think that medication would have caused any, I agree again with Professor Abbott about it. It probably would have increased her life expectancy a few months in the ICU, and that was about it.
But that's true of all approved drugs.
But here's the deal. So when we bring it to the community and make it about a case and about a lawsuit, we present it in a way that, it would have saved that kid's life. We would not have no doctors having doubt about it. It's just a question about, are we going to sacrifice public safety over these drugs? And again, as you said, it's very, most doctors in academic center have this ability to go ahead and use them for off-label drugs. It's just a matter of whether pharmaceutical companies should be enforcing them and should be doing all the advertising. My question was, I'm sorry, my comment took too long.
That's all right.
My question, however, was, if FDA is not going to do that, how are you going to prevent, or when you say about your nonprofit or people who are non-governmental overseeing, if there is something that is going to beyond the regulation, how you're going to enforce, how you're going to protect. That's what I don't have any problem with non-governmental regulation, but how are you going to protect the public?
Well, let me just ask the question the other way around. Right now, we have in the oncology area somewhere between 50 and 80 or 90% of the drug uses are off-label. Would you stop it all? Well, that's what I'm arguing for. And then the question is, well, how do you want to fine-tune it? We've already accepted the proposition, I think incorrectly, that promotion by drug companies is improper. So what we have is the regime that you want. There's no improvement that you can make of this regime. Now let me say something about academic medicine. I have the following view of academic medicine, which is somewhat different from your own. I think, like academic lawyers, we all believe in regulation through the Bar Association because we're cartel makers. And I think there's a lot of that in the medicine side. Let us experts in clinical medicine have a guaranteed source of income from this stuff, and we can do it very, very well. Nobody else knows enough to deal with us. If you were to go and ask the same question by professional people in statistics and economics and so forth, they have a very different view of the efficacy of this thing. You read somebody like Tom Phillipson, who spent his entire life doing this as a professional economist. He and his co-authors think that what takes place inside the medical profession is actually, in many cases, very weak because it relies too much on techniques that are too slow with respect to going wrong. And so what I would say is this: I am not against clinical trials. And in fact, when you have easy things to measure, like cholesterol trials and other kinds of standard drugs for an aging population, it's easy to get the numbers and easy to do the tests. But in a lot of cases, you don't have that luxury. And to use the same model, depending upon, without regard to all of the differences in the available data, is to me a serious mistake.
Well, that question seemed more directed to him about what he would replace FDA regulation.
Nothing.
Nothing. Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have in the past either suggested that the FDA should just be a certifying agency after stage 1 trials, and that voluntary organizations should essentially do the same thing, and that we should.
Yeah, I mean, if this were a different debate, that's a harder debate to win.
I won't get into that.
But I mean, I thought this was about off-label use.
It is about off-label use.
And the case there is overwhelmingly strong. The other case is much more controversial.
So let me take my 60 seconds. Unless we're more to another question.
I'd particularly like to get a question from a student.
Come on.
Well,
thanks.
She is a student.
My question is, how come both your arguments can't come in the middle in some ways? You can't downsize the FDA's control and let the 5 organizations kind of make it a little faster, try to save money.
So you're asking why we can't both get along?
You're asking a policy.
I mean,
that's fair.
So both of these arguments are on a spectrum, and I think that Professor Epstein would agree that he's pretty far on one end of the spectrum, and I'm, more in the medical orthodoxy end of the spectrum. But people have been proposing stages all along the way. I mean, you could totally revamp the FDA's authority to have a much stronger form of regulation, or some people have said, let's get rid of the FDA, we don't need that at all, and you could find a happy medium between the two. But I mean, for all the reasons we both discussed, we aren't moving towards the middle. But maybe you have. So.
Let's let Richard.
Yeah, no, I think, look, to talk about the issue which is not on the table, the general FDA, the reason one basically, even if you think yourself to be a libertarian, is that you like phase 1 trials, is they're relatively cheap to operate, they are kind of a public good that gives lots of information, and when they turn out to be negative, there's no dispute with respect to their application. And so if you give a stage 1 trial which kills 5 persons for every one that it saves, there's no physician exercising powers over prescription which will recommend them. But the further you go down on the trial stuff, it costs more and the information is less reliable in terms of relative costs and benefits. And for that point, what certification does is it says, hey, here's a group that thinks this thing is okay. But the key feature to understand why the FDA types hate certification is that anybody can do it. So I can turn to the von Mises Society and they can have a drug certification agency if they want to, organized by card-carrying libertarians. And then we could get Public Citizen out there and they could run their own. In fact, Public Citizen does run its own type of evaluation system. Generally speaking, I think they're too negative. They tend not to be wildly followed, although in 1971 they actually hit a home run on one of the cases they had. So sure, certification has a huge advantage, but the exclusion power, if the FDA keeps a drug off their market, there's no downstream person that can correct it. If the FDA lets a drug seem on the market, patients, patient groups, physicians, physician groups can veto its use by not using it. And the fact that many drugs fail suggests that it's not simply just an uncritical use. This information is too important. Lives are at stake. And let me just make on the one point, the typical good cancer drug today is a 6-month to a 9-month improvement particularly with second and third stage cancers. I was at a session with Jim Watson, and he talks about it. He says, "Problem with you doctors, every drug you have stinks," he said. And so I said, "So you want to kick all the stinky drugs off the market?" He didn't want to go that far, but there is no question that cancer research needs another generation of improvement. But you're not going to get that in a world in which that new generation will be idiosyncratic and will be all the harder to get through the FDA.
We have one more question.
Yeah.
Since the 90s, we saw that
Like, louder?
since the 90s, you've seen the danger of deregulation. And it seems like you want to put more power in the hands of private corporations to make the calls.
Which deregulation are you talking about?
I mean, from energy sector to banking. I mean, the more that they take their hands off, the more danger I see.
Well, let me sort of answer this question as best I can. With energy regulation, I mean, the story is completely mixed as to what it is that is going on. But there's no question in my mind that the heavy regulation of the nuclear power industry has taken off market a source of improvements that are no longer economically viable. Fracking, to me, is something which has proved to be an enormous advantage. Every single regulatory initiative by way of price control or extraction controls has generally failed in that particular industry, and all of the actual production, if you look at either miles driven by automobiles or pollution per unit of production, all of those things in a relatively deregulatory environment have worked. The financial sector is very different. I mean, I do work in that. And what happens is the run on the bank problem is a very serious kind of question for which deregulatory solutions do not entirely work. And I will tell you at the time when Lawrence Summers, who announces that he's the smartest man in the world but isn't, thought that counterparty security was sufficient, there were many of us who worked in the industry who said that the herd problem is very, very serious and that you have to change things. And some of us actually think that having capital requirements for bank rather than microscopic management through Dodd-Frank is appropriate. There is nobody I know who's a serious market economist who thinks that deregulation, pure and simple with respect to banking and other financial markets, is a first best solution. What the correct solutions are is genuinely subject to contestation, but I don't think that we think of it in that particular fashion. So I think you probably have to be aware of the fact that as you move from area to area, the externality problems, the coordination problems, the information problems start to differ, and so too ought your regulatory response. And I don't do health exclusively. In fact, I spend most of my time on other regulatory systems, and each of them in its own way is as complicated as the health system that you have to face.
I want to take this opportunity to thank both of our debaters. You've given us